levels going forward, as was in the.
So this is a supplemental year, and the idea of long-term moving of, monies out of the transportation, in my opinion, I'd be broadly supportive of that, because these are the vehicles that are going to be on our road.
Governor Inslee has proposed an increase in the cap for funding for special education. I wonder if you could address whether you support increasing the cap. I believe his proposal is 17.5% or 17.25%.
This is something that's been a House Republican priority. We've offered a number of different ways to do that. So
I think the House Democrats will be favorable in our response to the governor. I think it's what it is. I share former chair, how would you describe that? It's not intended to cover school districts' shortfalls in other areas by changing the enrollment numbers. It's intended to provide meaningful programmatic enhancements to students, and so that they have to fight for their particular individual education plan.
I can't argue with anything that the other two have just said. We advocated to, we didn't understand last year, I think it was last year, when we did the 13.5 to the 15 and a half. And so taking it to the 17.25, whatever, it's an area that it does need to be looked at, and so I would support it. We would generally support it.
Yeah, same. We made a significant investment in special ed last year, which I was very proud of, very glad that we could do that. I don't think that's our school districts. They're just sort of adjusting to the increments here. And I have a mix of school districts that I represent. Some are now covered. Importantly, as Representative Ormsby said, it's the families and the students who would, support additional funding towards raising that level for special ed.
Like to see, or you'd like to see funding increases, or that you think are critical to prioritize?
Thank you. We have place and way to care for mental health issues, behavioral health. We definitely need that. There's no doubt about that. I'm not saying that at all. To get more funding and more emphasis on prevention and community while they're still in their homes, with their families, with their support networks, still working. That's the place where I would love for us to get to as a state, that we're really investing in people being well for long before they get to the point where they need care in a hospital. We have a ways to go to get there. Somewhat driven by lawsuits, somewhat just driven by the sheer call. To answer your question, I'd like to see more emphasis on really wrapping services, making sure people get services in their communities, homes, when they still have a support network around them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Laurel Demkovich from the States News will be moderating the next.
Hello, everyone. If you could quiet down. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Laurel Demkovich. I'm a reporter at the Washington State Standard. Andy Billig, new to the leadership this year. So just to set the scene a little bit, you guys have 60 days starting on Monday. There's a lot of asks. We've already heard a lot about behavioral health, transportation, the economy, public safety. You have a little bit of extra change maybe to work with. You have some looming initiatives I'd like to hear just kind of down to view our thinking needs to get done this year. What are your caucus's priorities starting on?
Session, not big changes budgetarily, in the operating budget, connectedness of issues that we face and that we're trying to address. For example, housing is obviously, then in the behavioral health side, both mental health and treatment of substance use disorder and addressing the fentanyl crisis are going to be important. And when I say those three things, though, they're all connected to each other, right? They drive. I think the other big thing for us in the House will be the addressing climate and continuing to make sure that we move forward on addressing climate change and we don't under any circumstances start to turn backward on the commitments that we've made and that Washingtonians have made.
When you think about housing and behavioral health, childcare, climate action, gun violence, still people struggling in all of our communities. And so we need to continue that progress. We need to double down in those areas that think about short-term support, but also keep our eye on the long term. When I started in business, and my business partner and mentor, still my business partner and mentor 32 years later, always taught me that asset. Well, the people of Washington are going to own this state forever. And so we need to be thinking long-term when we're thinking about care, which is so important, long-term, to change the trajectory of a child's life in a positive way, and that progress going in all of those areas, but particularly in housing, behavioral health, childcare, K-12 education, and public safety.
Well, as so far until Senator Braun gets here, only member of the minority caucus, I've got a slightly different perspective. Washington State has so much potential, and I am privileged to lead a caucus of 40 House Republicans. It's failing right now. There's a growing catalog of crises that some of the most expensive child care in the country. And in too many ways, we seem going in the wrong direction. So House Republicans want to change how we do things here in Olympia and fix what's broken. So our priorities are going to be pretty straightforward and represent the public has continually said are their most important issues. We want to either lower the price of gas or at least provide rebates to drivers to offset the high price of gas, the second highest gas prices throughout most of 2023, and it's time that we use some of the CCA surplus to rebate drivers to offset the high price of gasoline. We need to hire more police officers. We don't need to have the most police officers per capita, but we shouldn't have the fewest police officers per capita. If we could just get to middle of the pack, that would be a improvement. We need to hire more paraeducators and tutors and reading coaches to help improve test scores and early elementary school literacy rates. We need to make it easier to cite childcare. Permanent housing solution is going to take some time, but in the meantime, we can at least remove the Republicans have plans to make it better and fix those problems.
Is for more on that front, specifically on the rent stabilization, tenant protections, which I know was kind of left behind a little bit last session.
Yeah, I think our renting homes. For me, who has a mortgage, I know for 30 years what my payment every month is going to be to stay in my home. Renters have no predictability and no stability, and it is contributing to homelessness in our state, as we've seen from studies that have come out. So trying to figure out stabilize rent increases and to make them more predictable for renters, I think will be a very important thing that we look at. This really hit home for me, Laurel, when I do coffee hours with constituents when I go back after session every year. And in the hours, I had two senior citizen women, one in particular who came to me with a whole packet of information to prove what she was asserting was true. And she's on a fixed income and her rent had increased 70% over a 2-year period into homelessness. So, I know Representative Alvarado has a bill pre-filed on stabilization, and we'll see through session. There are probably other approaches that can be taken too, but that's certainly Representative Alvarado's bill. But it says something about the do. There's some other things we've left on the table from last year. Representative Barkis's lot splitting bill that we'll continue to work on. I think there's been some trim on transit-oriented development. We'll see how that goes. So we're going to keep.
One of the things Representative Stokesbury referenced is just the long time frame on housing in particular, and that is the challenge. I mean, the good news is we've been putting a lot of money and investment and changes in policy over the last few years. You know, the bad news is it takes 3 or 4 years from doing those things before somebody, the door to their new home. And so we need to be thinking about ways to keep speeding that up. And we've done a lot. I mean, we helped last year with the permitting and moving faster. But one of the ways that we can get more housing, particularly right now in many communities, and we have this huge need for more residential apartments and condos and homes. And so Senator and Representative Wallen have a bill that would incentivize conversions from a lot of policy areas. Last year was sort of the big year. This is the short session, the follow-up. I think you'll see a lot of meaningful, but maybe smaller.
How the real world works. And Senator Billick sort of alluded to this, but we think by far the biggest and maybe the only thing we can really meaningfully do is housing imaginable in urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas. We just need more housing, and that will, by creating more supply, we will be able to lower the price of housing. And while solutions like rent control might be a short-term Band-Aid, in the long run, they're going to end up as failed policies because you're going to need to finance the building of new multifamily housing. Just try up in Washington State. And for builders to develop affordable multifamily housing. So all we can do to try to incentivize Representative Speaker Jenkins's constituent.
Mentioned transportation challenges. We heard from the chairs and the ranking members talking about potentially delaying projects. Is that something that we can tackle during this short session, and how do we expect to try to tackle that challenge this year?
Yeah, well, Drew, we have to tackle it, right? Because the bids are coming in much higher than what we originally projected they would be, and so that I watched the transportation panel, and I don't think I have very much to add to what they said to you. We are going to, I really have deep respect for my seatmate, Chair Fye, and for the whole Transportation Committee. Bipartisan way generally works to address whatever issues come up in transportation, so I have a great deal of confidence that folks are going to be high because they're going to have to be, but also probably deliver some news that not everybody's going to like to hear because all likely aren't going to stay on the same schedule they've been on. I think that is a high priority.
Representative Stokesbury, can I hear your thoughts on your thoughts on transportation problem and solutions?
Yeah, I lack the privilege of having heard what my seatmate, Representative Robertson, said at the Transportation Committee, Speaker Jenkins, that, it is a priority. Fixing the fish passage barriers is one of the many failures, I think, of state government over the last, not have taken a federal court order for us to do what's common sense. We spend all this time and energy, those kinds of things. Obviously, the challenge and the thornier question, and one where we will probably start to diverge. And let me back up too and just say I also commend Representative Fye for his bipartisanship on a lot of these issues. I think we were dissatisfied with the transportation package from about 2 years ago, but that example notwithstanding. Start to diverge though is where we come up with additional funding. I think Republicans have been saying for years that the operating budget is growing extremely rapidly, much more rapid than gas tax revenue is growing in the transportation budget. The budget, the general fund has about doubled in my 10 years here, more than doubled. We think and continue to think that there is ample money in the general fund to use some of that general tax. But Washington State is not the only state that struggles with Department of Transportation that comes in with projects over deadline and over budget. Every state deals with that, and we have the highest gas tax because we're one of the only states in the country that relies exclusively on the gas tax to fund roads. Almost every state, including states like California, use either general fund money or capital budget money, which is backed by general fund money, to help finance their roads. And Washington doesn't need to be an outlier. We can use general fund money, have a growing surplus yet again. We should use some of that money to help finance some of these needs like fish culverts and maintenance and repairs in the transportation budget.
On transportation, the transportation budget is under incredible stress right now because of declining gas tax revenues. But the initiative then really puts transportation on the hot seat, because if the climate commission to all of the negative impacts in terms of climate action that would result, there would also be would probably result in a hold or even decline in funding for just about everything in the transportation budget. So I'm worried about, we're especially worried about the transportation budget if for some reason the CCA was repealed.
That I think the repeal of the CCA actually gives us options for transportation that don't exist right now. Right now, for 3 decades, we've relied on gas taxes and bonding to pay for transportation. I think that's got us in a tough position all by itself. But the CCA actually effectively the option of a gas tax that is possible to do on a bipartisan basis. So I don't come to the same conclusion as Mike on the other side of the aisle. I think that the repeal of the CCA actually gives us options we don't currently have for transportation.
In the pink, purple.
Is there a plan to revisit the police pursuit bill in light of the state having some of the highest, if not the highest, car theft rates in the country?
Kate, I haven't seen any pre-filing on that, and no one has raised that to me. I think folks knew that but that's not something that I have heard very much about. When I talked to my police chief just a couple of weeks ago, policies in the state, right? I think what we are likely to really focus on is making sure that we can grow the number of police officers in Washington State. We've expanded the at doing that. I think, on how to speed up their processes, but that they don't have necessarily a shortage of applicants or folks who qualify. It's just a long process to move people through. So if there are ways that we can help much on the pursuit side.
More officers they wouldn't be able to pursue for certain crimes. So is there any sort of thought to revisit that? And I guess I would open that up. The opposing party, is it or the GOP, would that?
Democrats and Republicans that would return the pursuit law to how it changes. In my district, which has several cities in South King County and East Pierce County, every police chief and mayor I've talked to has asked for the rollback and a return to the status quo of census. I haven't done an official vote count, but just based on how many Democrats have sponsored the bill and knowing how many people in my caucus want it, I think if that bill hit the House floor, it would pass pretty easily. So I think we ought to rule bill. I think we ought to be responsive to the citizens bill or an initiative to the legislature if it gets certified.
And I just wanted to mention, and the speaker alluded to this, but most of the urban police departments, so most residents of Washington live in jurisdictions to how it was before 2021. It wouldn't actually change things on the ground for most Washingtonians and most police departments because everybody agrees that it's dangerous. And I strongly supported the change that we made last year. I thought that was important.
Speaker, I'm Hallie from the AP. Speaker, I was wondering if you could...
Hallie, I think what we heard yesterday is they've all 6 been provisionally certified, which I believe means that enough signatures if the rejection rate is kind of the standard rejection rate for initiatives that they would make the ballot. We won't get final, we won't on them, so that probably means they may not be referred to committee until then. They are exempt, which it was really like the big railroad barons that folks didn't want taking over the state, and they wanted the people to be able to legislate. So now is an ultra wealthy multi-millionaire buying his way onto the ballot, and we'll have to make decisions about whether or not those are heard. They automatically go to the ballot, whether or not they're heard, whether or not we'll consider alternatives. Those things are still being considered now they were turned in very late. I do look into poverty before they can get some sort of long-term care. I have confidence in the voters in the state that they believe our investments in K-12 education and in childcare to increase, not be decreased by eliminating the capital gains tax on a few ultra-wealthy people in the state. I think the voters in this state particularly want to turn our backs on climate change and quit addressing climate change. So that conversation is yet to come on the ballot. The big question for us is, will there be alternatives or not? And this is my somewhat long answer to, I don't. But I think we'll consider that. Those will be under consideration.
If I may, I'm just going to push back on the timeline. First of all, we're supposed to consider those a top priority right after the budget. So I think these should be top of list next Monday, whichever ones are certified. And as they become certified, he did say it'd be as late as, I think, 9 February is the date I heard. So we won't get all of them, but we're going to get some of them, and we ought to be focused on them right away. And we can talk about how they got on the ballot. That's an easy way to distract from the fact that we had, we had a record number on the backs of working Washingtonians. And that's what CCA does. It's a highly regressive tax on the backs of working Washingtonians working. They want better. We should try to do better.
And I would just add to that, I mean, whatever the motivations of the sponsor of these initiatives is, there's still, like Senator Braun alluded to, 400,000 ordinary Washingtonians that signed, each one of them, none of whom, or, a very small number of whom have, any like meaningful financial gain. They just want to do what they think is best for the people of Washington and want more choices. They're dissatisfied with some of the policies that have come out of Olympia. There was an Elway poll this morning, thanks to Crosscut for partnering with that, that showed 57% of Washingtonians want to repeal the capital gains tax. About 60% want to repeal the police pursuit law. So clearly,
Half of the people of Washington. And these initiatives rolls, and I have confidence in the voters. I think once all the information gets out there, I think people do want to take responsibility for our part in climate change. They do want investments to mitigate the impacts of climate change. They do want more investment in childcare and K-12 education. And I think that's how things will bear out. And we do come up with some alternatives that help to make it better. On the CCA, there's the idea of linking with Quebec and California. Everybody thinks that's a good idea. That's a way that we can lower the cost and continue to be responsible. And a lot of people that want more investment in state services. I want that too.
I do have my own question, but I do want to follow up to what your response was to my colleague from the Associated Press. You mentioned the millionaire backing these initiatives, Brian Haywood, to buy policy. Did you speak out against Paul Allen and Nick Hanauer spending millions of dollars, huge gun control initiative that went on the ballot in 2018?
Was that the established in Washington State, what was set out? I'm not an originalist, but it is sad that if not every county in the state, nearly every county in the state voted in favor of that initiative, if I remember correctly. So I don't remember what I spoke about or wouldn't speak about. Now, these 6 initiatives are funded almost exclusively by one single funder who will achieve great benefit to his finances should some of them pass. Now, that might be something good for voters to consider too. So my commentary was that
in voters, if these do end up going on the ballot in November, to make people sign each and every one of these. So for Washingtonians who hear that comment, who did sign the initiatives because they're struggling under the weight of increased gas prices, because dealing with crime issues related to police pursuit, what do you say to them if your comments come off as dismissive?
Yeah, I don't think they're dismissive at all. I just think that when you put a premium on the head of every signature, it motivates people to say lots of things to get people to sign. And the actual campaign that happens when there's a real dialogue about what the impacts of the initiative are, that's the signatures. But if you want to get into an argument about how all the signatures were gathered, I guess we could get into an argument about that. And the number of people that I've had who said, I think I just signed something, this is what they told me, is that what it does? And I said, no, that's not exactly what it does. And I don't think there are 400,000 people who are all misled. I think log in which each campaign makes their case, and voters really get a fuller perspective of what the consequences of these initiatives are, what's likely to happen, and then can make their decisions about what they want Washington to do.
Grace?
I was hoping to ask Representative Stonier, but Speaker Jenkins, since you did recently talk to the Tacoma Police Department, I'm wondering in the wake of the death of Manny Ellis and that trial, whether you've had any conversations with the Tacoma Police Department or with your members about how that trial went. Hi, I'm Grace with the Standard, sorry.
Grace, I just feel like I'm taking up all the airtime here. Listen, so it was just very hard for my community. I do think that the city of Tacoma has for a long time supportive of the independent prosecutions bill, and I know Representative Stonier continues to work on it. That bill has had a kind of a long and chaff because there are constitutional challenges in how you can draft a bill to shouldn't have a jurisdiction prosecuting law enforcement officers that they oversee, right? And when you see the Manny Ellis trial, that was an independent prosecution, right? Because the Attorney General's office did it, or as independent as we have in Washington. So that's, I think, something that probably citizens think of as fair and appropriate. But whether or not we can get that bill across the finish line is really a question of constitutional law, I think, in a lot of ways, and whether or not we can find a design that meets constitutional standards.
Does anyone else, maybe on the Republican side, want a independent prosecutor proposal, just to give some more voices?
Well, this is obviously in the speaker's community, and I know her district or her community like she does. But I will tell you, and I think at some point, if you have an independent trial, and you ought to be thinking about, because earlier she said something that I completely agree with, which is we need to start rebuilding our law enforcement community around the state. If we're going to have any hope of turning the tide on violent crime, on property crime, on auto theft in our state, we have to rebuild our law enforcement community. I'm sure somebody said this before, but we're the worst in the country, the least law enforcement per capita in the country. If we're going to fix but we have a real problem in recruiting more folks into this very important profession because we're not doing that right now. We're training them to a certain standard, and we changed the standard from a reasonable officer standard to a reasonable reasonable person standard. And while that sounds to folks not involved in this policy like not a big deal, it's actually a really big deal because we're taking officers and to the public, and then we're going to ask you to be held to a standard by a reasonable person, which sounds great, right? But that reasonable person doesn't know how this seemingly simple result is creating enormous conflict in recruiting. We got to treat them fair to what we train them to do if we're going to have any success.
Purple?
When juveniles commit crimes, and we have been seeing a big uptick as far as stolen cars, the carjackings, the Kias being stolen, but a smash and grab by kids. And one thing that I'm hearing from different police agencies is that they can't interview the children once they're detained, not like shoplifting, but a violent felony crime. And that's hindering their ability to solve cases, to pursue these cases. What's going to be done this session to address this other large concern when it comes to public safety and kids?
Thanks for the question. It's certainly not my area of policy expertise, but I think you're referring to a bill that we passed a couple of years ago that it does not restrict police from interviewing juveniles. I want to be clear about that. It says before police interview a juvenile, the juvenile has to have access to an attorney, and that access can be on a phone. I've talked to police officers, but they even have a child sitting in the back of the police car. It's not like they have to drive to the station down there. There's a hotline, the police officer calls, they hand the phone to the juvenile talks to juveniles.
I do completely agree with that, and I don't mean to misphrase the question, which, clearly I did. But what we're hearing, so I just spoke with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and they were saying, once you get an attorney on the phone, immediately it's, investigations and just solving crimes when it comes to juveniles.
Yeah, well, and those juveniles have the right, just like every citizen, to talk to education and early learning is about, obviously, there are things we need to do now for public safety. We, I think, have broad agreement on, officers. Senator Lovick, I really appreciate his great leadership and the bipartisan. Go to Burien for the long term for the training, but because there's training now in Pasco, she gets to be a police officer. So I think A lot to do on public safety, and I think we are making steps in the right direction. But I also want to think about that long term, and how are we supporting these kids? And high quality early learning is the number one way to help change the trajectory of a child's life. We know there's lots of documentation that it means fewer kids committing crimes in jails. It means better health outcomes, better educational outcomes, greater college
passed a couple years ago, and this isn't my policy expertise area either, but here's the difference is I think we ought to be listening to the folks who have to implement it. That we have the sheriffs, we have police chiefs, we have prosecutors saying this is unworkable. We are an outlier in this policy nationwide. It's not a common policy nationwide. We have all the experts, the folks who actually have to implement the policy, and I don't think they intend any harm to children. They just want to execute the law as provided to them, and we've just, essentially handcuffed them, for lack of a better word. And to say, wait, well, we can get around it with a hotline, we're being told that it functionally doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So this is a broader problem, whether it's, and Senator Billig mentioned K-12, I think we're failing our kids in K-12, but it's much broader than that. It goes from across the spectrum. We're failing them in early education and childcare and K-12 and higher ed, and increasingly in places like juvenile justice care, in our CPS system. We're failing them across the board. We need to take a look, and it's not that we need to somehow, case basically protect them from the consequences of their actions. We want these kids to go through, if they commit a crime, the best justice system, get the chance to get back on a better track, give them that chance.